Deep in a buried library, ancient clay tablets hold secrets that defy our understanding of history. The Hittite Empire was a Bronze Age superpower, a rival to Egypt and Babylon, and for centuries their capital city of Hattusa lay silent and forgotten. But when archaeologists uncovered its royal archives, they found more than just dry records of battles and treaties. They discovered a collection of texts so strange, so deeply personal and bizarre, that they shattered our image of this lost civilization. By the end of this journey through 25 of their most peculiar discoveries, you will see the ancient world in a completely new light, through the eyes of kings who argued with gods and priests who performed rituals we can barely comprehend. How did a prince's mysterious disappearance nearly start a war with Egypt? And what was the truth behind a ritual where a commoner was made king for a day only to be sacrificed? The answers are etched in clay, waiting to challenge everything you thought you knew. What does it truly mean to uncover a lost world? The very first mystery begins with a royal marriage proposal that vanished into thin air. A Hittite prince named Zannanza was chosen for a union that should have sealed peace between two superpowers. The Egyptian queen, a widow, had written a desperate letter asking for a Hittite prince to become her husband and the new pharaoh. It was an unprecedented offer, one that promised to bind the Hittite Empire and Egypt together in an unbreakable alliance. The Hittite king, after some understandable hesitation, agreed. He sent his son, the young prince, on the long and dangerous journey south to Egypt, but Zannanza never arrived. He disappeared somewhere along the way, and with him all hope for that historic peace. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and furious. The Hittites were enraged, convinced their prince had been ambushed and murdered on Egyptian orders. They accused the Egyptian court of the ultimate betrayal, of extending a hand of friendship only to conceal a dagger. The Egyptians, for their part, denied everything, claiming they never even saw the prince. The archives preserve this furious exchange of letters, each side blaming the other, each accusing the other of lies and deceit. Was it a simple case of bandits on a lonely road, or was it a calculated assassination designed to provoke a conflict? The truth is lost to us, a ghost in the broken clay tablets. All we have are the accusations and the lingering question. Did a queen's plea for a husband actually serve as the perfect pretext for a war that someone, on one side of the desert or the other, already wanted to fight? But the archives hold more than just the ghost of a missing prince. They also contain the desperate, echoing voice of a king brought to his knees. A devastating plague swept through the Hittite lands, killing countless people and crippling the empire for years. And their great king, Mursili II, was not looking for a military solution or a medical cure. He was looking for a reason, and he found it in the sins of his own father. In a series of incredible texts known as the Plague Prayers, King Mursili does something that feels shockingly modern in its raw vulnerability. He stands before his gods and he argues. He doesn't just beg for mercy, he pleads his case like a lawyer in a divine courtroom. The logic of the plague, as he saw it, was terrifyingly simple. His father, the previous king, had broken a sacred oath and committed a terrible crime. Now the gods were punishing the entire kingdom for that single transgression. Mursili's prayers are a frantic attempt to negotiate. He confesses the sins of his father that he himself did not commit. He lists everything he has done to try and make things right, all the rituals performed and the offerings made. He essentially tells the gods, I have paid the debt, so why do you still punish my people? Can you not see that I am trying? This is not a distant ceremonial ruler. This is a man weighed down by a responsibility he never asked for, trying to reason with forces he cannot control. He is asking the most human of questions. Why must the children suffer for the sins of the parents? The texts give us a window into a world where a king's primary duty was to be a bridge to the divine. where the health of the entire nation depended on his personal piety and his ability to keep the gods happy. It was a burden no single person should ever have to carry. Yet the archives hold more than just prayers and plagues. They conceal a political mystery so deep that it was literally cast in bronze only to be rewritten by the victors. This is the story of Kurunta, a Hittite prince who was given a kingdom of his own, a man who may have dared to claim the title of great king for himself. It begins with a treaty, a remarkable document inscribed not on fragile clay but on a durable sheet of bronze. This was no ordinary agreement. In it, the Hittite great king formally recognized Kurunta as the king of a vital southern region called Hattusa. The treaty granted him staggering autonomy, making him almost an equal, a partner in rule rather than a mere subordinate. For an empire built on centralized power, this was an unprecedented act. Why would a Hittite monarch willingly carve out such a powerful, semi-independent realm for his cousin? Was it a reward for loyalty or a desperate compromise to prevent a civil war? The bronze tablet seemed to settle the matter, a permanent record of a unique political solution. But then the story twists. Decades later, archaeologists found a royal seal, a small stone cylinder used to stamp official documents. And this seal, belonging to Kurunta, did not call him the king of Hattusa. It boldly proclaimed him the great king, the supreme title reserved only for the emperor in the capital city of Hattusa. This single artifact shatters the official story. Did Kurunta, in his later years, grow powerful enough to declare himself the true emperor, sparking a conflict that the royal annals later purged from history? Was the bronze tablet treaty a lie, or did it become a trigger for a usurpation that almost succeeded? The archives are silent on this point, offering no chronicle of a war between cousins. This silence is itself the loudest evidence, suggesting that someone, after the fact, worked very hard to make sure this story was never told. The truth of Kurunta's ambition remains one of the Hittite Empire's most tantalizing and unresolved secrets. But for all the political intrigue, the archives also reveal a practice so strange it defies modern logic. A king could be replaced not by a rival but by a commoner plucked from the streets. This was the ritual of the substitute king, a desperate act of supernatural deception performed when the omens turned deadly. If the stars foretold the king's imminent death, a specific ritual was set in motion. The genuine monarch would step down from the throne, and a mentally disabled man, a foreigner, or even a prisoner would be installed in his place. This substitute was not a temporary regent. He was a living sacrifice. For a few days, he was treated with all the royal honors. He wore the king's robes, ate the king's food, and slept in the king's bed. The entire court would treat him as the true sovereign, all to convince the gods and the fates that this man was the real target. The real king, meanwhile, would live in hiding, referred to only as the peasant. He would perform rituals of mourning for his own supposed impending death. The instructions from the archives are chillingly specific. They detail every action, every offering, every word to be spoken. The entire performance was designed to channel the divine threat away from the true ruler and onto this unwitting stand-in. And when the period of danger passed, when the evil omen was considered complete, the deception reached its brutal conclusion. The substitute king, having absorbed the fate meant for the monarch, was ritually killed. His wife, if he had one chosen for the ceremony, would be killed alongside him. They were sent to the gods as the promised victims, sealing the bargain and allowing the real king to return to his throne, his life spared by this macabre sleight of hand. What does this say about the weight of Hittite kingship? The king was not just a man, he was the living embodiment of the state. His survival was so vital to the cosmos that the entire empire would participate in an elaborate, murderous lie to protect him. It reveals a world where fate was a tangible force that could be tricked, and where the life of a single person, even the most powerful, was considered so precious that another would die in his place. This was not seen as murder, but as a terrible, necessary transaction for the survival of the kingdom itself. Even the most elaborate deceptions could not protect the Hittites from the shadows that waited beyond death itself. The archives contain a ritual for a creature they called the Olwanza, a restless spirit that could claw its way back from the grave. This was not a ghost that merely haunted places, but a vengeful entity that actively sought to drain the life from the living, a concept that sends a familiar chill down our spines. The procedure to stop such a being was a complex act of supernatural defense, a desperate exorcism to send the dead back to their rest for good. The ritual began with the creation of a substitute, a small clay figurine meant to represent the troublesome Olwanza. This was not a simple effigy. It was a focal point, a vessel into which the malignant presence could be lured and trapped. The priests would then perform a series of animal sacrifices, not as mere offerings, but as a brutal form of bargaining. The blood and life force of these animals were presented as a payment to the underworld gods, a plea for them to reclaim the spirit that had escaped their domain. The most critical step involved binding. The clay figurine, now believed to hold the essence of the Olwanza, was tightly bound with thread or wire, physically restricting it just as the spells aimed to restrict its power. Incantations were spoken, commanding the spirit to leave the world of the living and return to the darkness. Finally, the bound figurine was often buried far away or thrown into a deep river, a physical banishment to mirror the spiritual one. The echoes here are unmistakable, a being that returns from the dead to harm the living, the use of a stake-like binding to immobilize it, the need for a ritualistic destruction to ensure it cannot return. This is not the vampire of Gothic fiction, but it lives in the same ancestral fear. It reveals a world where death was not a clean end, where the wrongs of a person's life could fester into a tangible threat for those they left behind. The Hittites were not just building an empire in the land of the living, they were constantly negotiating with the dangers of the world to come. The diplomatic correspondence from Hattusa takes an even more personal turn with a truly baffling document, the Tawagalawa letter. Here, a Hittite king, likely Hattusili III, is not writing to a traditional rival like Egypt, but to the mysterious king of Ahiowa, a land most scholars now believe was a major power of Mycenaean Greece. The subject is a renegade Hittite prince named Piama-Redu, a constant thorn in the empire's side who has fled to and is being sheltered within Ahiowan territory. This isn't a standard, stiff diplomatic threat. The tone is strangely conversational, almost like one frustrated ruler complaining to a peer about a mutual, troublesome acquaintance. The Hittite king references a previous personal meeting between them, writing, "When I came to your father, you and I were in friendly terms." He reminds the Ahiowan king of their past accord, using it as leverage in a delicate dance over the fugitive. He doesn't just demand Piama-Redu's extradition, he pleads, he cajoles, and he even tries to shame the foreign king, asking why he continues to protect a man who causes so much instability. The letter reveals a world where the Aegean and Anatolian worlds were not separate spheres, but were intimately connected through diplomacy, conflict, and personal relationships. This is not a story of isolated civilizations, but of a networked Bronze Age, where a prince on the run could become a diplomatic crisis spanning the entire Mediterranean. The very existence of this letter forces us to redraw the map, placing the legendary heroes of Mycenaean Greece right on the doorstep of the Hittite Empire, not as myth but as active players in a high-stakes political game. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that seem the most mundane. Tucked away among the royal proclamations and esoteric rituals was a simple-looking tablet that would ultimately become the key to unlocking the entire Hittite world. It was a bilingual omen text, a side-by-side translation of a Mesopotamian Akkadian text into the Hittite language. To a modern reader, it might look like a student's foreign language workbook, a series of phrases written in 2 columns. For the Hittite scribes of 3,000 years ago, that is precisely what it was. Akkadian was the language of international diplomacy and high scholarship across the ancient Near East, much like Latin was in medieval Europe. Hittite scholars needed to master this complex cuneiform script and its foreign vocabulary to read the sophisticated omen literature pouring in from Babylonian centers of learning. This tablet was their study guide, their cheat sheet. They could look at a line of dense Akkadian text predicting the future from the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of a sheep, and right beside it, they would find the clear Hittite translation. It was a practical tool for ancient bureaucrats, utterly unremarkable in its own time. But for the archaeologists and linguists of the 19th and 20th centuries, this tablet was nothing short of a Rosetta Stone. When the ruins of Hattusa were first uncovered, no one on earth could read a single word of Hittite. The language was a complete mystery, a collection of intricate symbols that resisted all attempts at translation for decades. Scholars could read Akkadian, they knew its grammar and its vast vocabulary. So when they found this bilingual text, they finally had a direct point of reference. They could take a known Akkadian sentence and see, word for word, its Hittite equivalent. It was the linguistic key that turned an impenetrable lock. Slowly, painstakingly, the strange symbols began to make sense. The Hittite language was revealed to be the earliest known member of the Indo-European family, a relative of English, Greek, and Sanskrit, hidden in the heart of Anatolia for millennia. Every story we have encountered so far, from the missing prince to the plague prayers, from the substitute king to the restless dead, became accessible only because of this one unassuming tablet. It reminds us that history's greatest secrets are not always guarded by monsters or hidden in treasure chests. Sometimes they are patiently waiting in the teacher's answer key, left behind by a student who never could have imagined we would be looking over his shoulder. While they fought political battles and appeased angry spirits, the Hittites also told stories of cosmic wars, preserving a myth of such staggering scale that it challenges our imagination. This is the Song of Alchemy, an epic tale of a monster born not from flesh but from cold, unfeeling stone. The story begins with a plot by the old god Kumarbi, the deposed king of the gods, to overthrow his successor, the storm god Teshub. His plan for revenge was not to raise an army but to literally grow a champion. He lay with a massive cliff, and from this union a son was born, a living creature made entirely of diorite stone. They named him Alchemy. This was no ordinary giant. The gods placed the infant monster on the right shoulder of Appelluri, a colossal being who stood in the great sea, holding the sky and the earth apart on his own shoulders. There, planted on this living pillar of the universe, Alchemy began to grow at an alarming rate. Each day he grew another mile, rising from the sea like a terrible, jagged mountain. He grew so vast that he soon blocked the very sight of the heavens from the gods in their celestial home. The sun and moon gods could no longer see the earth, and the storm god Teshub, looking down from his mountain, saw only this new, terrifying stone peak where there had been only water before. The imagery is profoundly strange, a being rooted on the body of the world's foundation. Growing so large he becomes a new part of the cosmos itself, a weapon designed to literally eclipse the divine. What does this tell us about the Hittite view of the world? It paints a picture of a universe that is not a fixed, permanent structure, but a dynamic and fragile arrangement, balanced on the shoulders of a single, patient giant. The very sky could be blocked, the cosmic order overturned, by a single, perfectly engineered flaw. The story reveals a deep anxiety that the foundations of reality were not as secure as they seemed, and that chaos was always just one clever plot away from breaking through. This epic was not even originally theirs. It was an adaptation of older Hurrian myths, which the Hittite scribes carefully copied and translated, making it their own. In doing so, they showed that their empire was built not just on military might, but on a thirst for knowledge, collecting the grandest stories of their neighbors and weaving them into the fabric of their own identity. The stone giant Ullikummi was more than a monster. He was a symbol of a world where the earth, the sea, and the sky were all connected in a precarious living balance, a balance that could be shattered by a single stone. The Hittite world was one where a person's entire existence could be defined by a single, sacred duty. Among the most mysterious figures in the archives is a man known only by his title, the Man of the Storm God. This was not a name but an office, a role so charged with divine power that the person who held it lived under a cloud of perpetual and strange restrictions. His life was governed by a list of taboos so severe they read like a prison sentence for the soul. He was forbidden from ever looking upon a dead body. He could not eat certain common foods. The texts do not tell us why these rules existed, only that breaking them would invite catastrophe. The logic seems to have been one of purity. The Man of the Storm God was a living conduit to the most powerful deity in the Hittite pantheon, a vessel for divine will. Any contact with death, any consumption of an impure substance, would corrupt that vessel, breaking the connection and unleashing the storm god's wrath upon the entire kingdom. His primary duty, as far as we can tell, was to perform the crucial rituals that kept the god appeased and the rains coming. He was the human anchor for the weather itself. Can you imagine the psychological weight of such a life? Every waking moment was a tightrope walk over a chasm of divine anger. A single misstep, an accidental glance at a funeral procession, a bite of the wrong food, and he might be personally responsible for a drought that would starve thousands. This was not a life of privilege, but one of immense, isolating burden. He was set apart from society, not to be worshipped, but to serve as a fragile insulator between his people and the raw, unpredictable power of the heavens. The Hittite scribes did not only record their own world, they were also fascinated by the ruins that lay all around them. The archives contain meticulous, almost obsessive, descriptions of cities and temples that were already ancient and abandoned in their own time. They wrote down the old names of these crumbling sites, detailed the gods once worshipped there, and even recorded the forgotten royal dynasties that had built them centuries before. This antiquarian interest is deeply strange for a civilization we often see as purely pragmatic, a Bronze Age superpower concerned only with war and administration. Why would they invest such effort in cataloging the dead past? For modern archaeologists, these texts have become an invaluable treasure map, a Hittite description of a lost city, with its specific location near two rivers and a distinctive mountain pass, has often been the crucial clue that led researchers directly to its foundations. It is as if the Hittites left behind a 3,000-year-old guidebook written specifically for us. They were the first archaeologists walking among the ruins of their own landscape and trying to make sense of the ghosts that came before them. This practice reveals a layer of Hittite thought we rarely appreciate, a deep historical consciousness and a reverence for the sacred geography of their land, even when its original inhabitants were long turned to dust. The Hittite archives preserve a desperate pact signed with a phantom. In the final, fading years of the empire, a great king put his seal to a formal treaty, not with a traditional rival like Egypt, but with a man named Kurunta, the king of a people from the coast of western Anatolia, a region suddenly swarming with groups we now call the Sea Peoples. This document is a historical thunderclap. For generations, the story of the Bronze Age collapse has been told as a simple one, of mysterious maritime raiders appearing from the sea to burn cities and topple empires. Yet here, etched in clay, is proof that the Hittite Empire in its final days was not merely fighting these groups, but was actively forging alliances with them. They were trying to turn one faction of these feared seafarers into a buffer, a shield against the chaos. Think about the staggering implications of this. The Hittite state, one of the most powerful bureaucratic machines of the ancient world, was so weakened, so desperate, that it was forced to negotiate with the very forces that would soon contribute to its complete and utter destruction. This was not a simple story of invaders versus defenders. It was a complex, collapsing world of shifting loyalties and frantic diplomacy, where today's ally could be tomorrow's destroyer. The treaty itself outlines the obligations of both sides, demanding mutual military support and the extradition of fugitives, treating this coastal power as a legitimate partner. Why would the sea peoples agree? Perhaps they saw a crumbling giant ripe for manipulation, or maybe they needed a stable partner for trade and supply. This single tablet shatters the old image of a single, unified wave of destruction. It reveals the end of the Bronze Age not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, painful unraveling, a time when empires made deals with the shadows that were already consuming them. Yet even their most desperate diplomatic efforts could not shield them from the smallest of killers. In a world without antivenom, a single scorpion sting could mean a slow, painful death, and the Royal Archives preserve a startlingly specific ritual created as a defense. This was the ritual of Zui, a complex procedure that blended practical first aid with a profound belief in sympathetic magic. The entire ceremony was named for the woman who performed it, a specialist named Zui, whose knowledge turned a common threat into a battleground for the gods. The ritual began with the patient, the person who had been stung. They were made to lie down while Zui began a series of precise, almost surgical actions. She would take a live goat and place it directly upon the victim's body, focusing on the area of the sting. The animal was not just a prop, it was a living vessel, a substitute. As incantations were spoken to the scorpion god, the venom, the invisible poison coursing through the patient's veins, was believed to be magically transferred out of the human and into the body of the goat. The logic was one of exchange, a life for a life. The goat, having absorbed the sickness, would then be driven far away from the village, carrying the poison and the danger with it, a physical banishment of the illness. But the ritual did not end there. Zui would then prepare a special poultice, a mixture of herbs, beer, and fine oil, which was carefully applied to the wound. Every step was accompanied by rhythmic recitations, calls to the gods to seal the magic and to heal the flesh. This was not superstition in a vacuum, it was an integrated system. The Hittites understood that the scorpion's venom was a physical substance causing physical harm, hence the medicinal poultice. But they also believed the event was governed by supernatural forces, a god who had sent the scorpion as a weapon. The ritual therefore had to address both realms at once, treating the body while negotiating with the divine. It reveals a world where every natural danger, from a plague to a simple sting, was a transaction between humanity and the unpredictable powers that ruled the universe. Healing was a matter of state security, and the Hittite royal court was apparently not convinced their own doctors were up to the task. The archives reveal a bizarre and recurring theme, a kind of medical diplomacy where Hittite kings sent urgent letters to their counterparts in Egypt, not to request gold or soldiers, but to demand the immediate dispatch of skilled physicians. One such letter from a Hittite monarch to the Egyptian pharaoh is startlingly direct. It does not ask, it essentially commands, "Send me a doctor." The tone suggests this was not a one-time request, but part of an ongoing and tense negotiation over the very people who could keep a king alive. The situation grows even stranger when you read between the lines of the correspondence. There are hints and accusations that the Hittites were not always waiting for a polite agreement. They sometimes seem to have simply taken the physicians they needed, either by preventing Egyptian doctors already in Hattusa from returning home, or by arranging for their passage and then making their return conditional on some other diplomatic concession. Imagine being one of these physicians, a highly trained expert from the Nile Valley, suddenly told you are being sent to the cold, mountainous heart of Anatolia, and then learning your trip home depends on the resolution of a trade dispute or the return of a fugitive. You become a political pawn, your medical skills a form of international currency. Why would a powerful empire like the Hittites resort to what looks like the state-sponsored abduction of medical professionals? The answer lies in a profound belief in the superiority of foreign, specifically Egyptian, healing arts. To the Hittites, Egypt was the pinnacle of medical science. Their doctors were renowned across the ancient world for their knowledge of anatomy, their vast pharmacopoeia of herbs and minerals, and their sophisticated surgical techniques. A Hittite king suffering from a persistent eye ailment or a troubling digestive issue would not have placed his full trust in a local healer. He wanted the very best, and the very best in his mind came from the Nile. This reveals a fascinating crack in the facade of imperial pride. In matters of war and treaty, the Hittite king was a peer to the pharaoh, a mighty emperor. But in the vulnerable, intimate space of his own Sikt, he was just a patient, willing to leverage his entire diplomatic apparatus to get the care he believed he needed. It was a tacit admission that for all their military might and complex rituals, some things, the things that truly mattered for life itself, were believed to be understood better by their rivals. The most fascinating lies are often the ones that contain a kernel of truth. Deep within the archives, we find a text that is not a prayer or a treaty, but a personal manifesto, a king's attempt to justify his own power grab to both his contemporaries and to the gods. This is the Apology of Hattusa III, a document that reads like a cross between a legal brief and a personal diary, written by the usurper himself to explain why he had to overthrow his own nephew, Hattusa. Hattusa does not deny the act of taking the throne. Instead, he builds his case with painstaking detail, weaving together threads of personal insult, political necessity, and divine will. He portrays himself not as an ambitious schemer, but as a patient and pious man pushed to his limits. He recounts how his nephew, once he became king, systematically stripped him of the lands and titles he had earned through a lifetime of loyal service. The narrative is filled with a sense of personal betrayal, of a man watching his life's work being dismantled by an ungrateful and incompetent ruler. He claims he endured this humiliation for years, turning the other cheek until it became clear that Hattusha's poor leadership was threatening the very stability of the empire. The final straw, according to Hattusa, was not a political move but a deeply personal one. He accuses his nephew of persecuting his wife, the Queen Pujuhepa, a beloved and powerful figure in her own right. By framing the conflict as a defense of his family's honor, Hattusa makes his rebellion feel less like a coup and more like a righteous, almost chivalric duty. But the true masterstroke of the apology is its spiritual justification. Hattusa claims that his entire life was guided by the hand of the goddess Ishtar. From a sickly childhood where she saved him to his military victories where she fought beside him, his rise was not his own doing but the fulfillment of a divine plan. The seizure of the throne, therefore, was not an act of disloyalty to the crown, but the ultimate act of loyalty to the gods. He was not a traitor, but an instrument of heaven, removing a king who had lost divine favor. This blend of the personal and the prophetic makes the apology a stunningly sophisticated piece of ancient propaganda. It is one of the earliest examples we have of a ruler meticulously crafting his own narrative, writing his own version of history into the official record to ensure that his legacy, and not his nephew's, would be the one that echoed through time. The sophistication of Hittite power extended even to the management of their most vital military asset, the war horse. Among the thousands of tablets in the Royal Archives, one stands out for its sheer, meticulous detail, a document known today as the Hittite text. It is the world's oldest surviving horse training manual, written by a man named Hittite, who was not a Hittite but a Hurrian from the land of Mitanni. His expertise was so revered that the Hittite court hired him to compose this masterwork, a 7-tablet guide that lays out an astonishingly complex 184-day training regimen for chariot horses. This was not a simple set of riding instructions, it was a rigorous program of athletic conditioning, a Bronze Age blueprint for creating the ultimate equine warrior. The text prescribes a method of interval training that feels shockingly modern. It details exactly how far a horse should be driven at a trot, then at a canter, and then how long it should be allowed to rest, with the distances and intensities carefully adjusted week by week to build stamina and explosive power without breaking the animal's spirit. But the strangeness goes further. The manual instructs trainers to swim their horses across rivers, a practice that builds muscle mass and cardiovascular strength in a low-impact way. It dictates specific diets and feeding schedules, and even specifies the precise times of day for exercises, showing a deep understanding of biorhythms and recovery. The entire process was a marathon of controlled stress and reward, designed to transform a powerful but skittish animal into a disciplined, unflappable partner in the chaos of a chariot charge. This was the hidden science behind the Hittite war machine. Their legendary chariot corps, which could dominate battlefields from Anatolia to Syria, was not just a matter of having more horses, but of having better trained, stronger, and more resilient ones. Kikulay's text reveals a level of specialized knowledge that rivals any modern training program, proving that the Hittites understood that true power did not lie only in the sword or the spear, but in the carefully cultivated strength of the creature that carried them into battle. Even the royal throne itself could fall sick. The Hittites believed their king's seat of power was not just a piece of furniture, but a living, breathing extension of the kingdom's fortune. If a terrible omen appeared or a major military defeat shattered the land, the throne was considered ritually impure, a state they called crippled. A wounded throne meant a wounded nation, and so they developed an incredibly complex ceremony known as the Salis Wastais ritual, a literal procedure to heal the seat of power. This was not a quick cleansing. The ritual unfolded over multiple days, a meticulous sequence of symbolic acts designed to purge the spiritual infection from the very heart of the state. Priests would bring specific offerings to the throne, treating it as a patient. They presented fine cloths, precious oils, and special foods, not to a god but to the throne itself, as if nourishing it back to health. The incantations spoken were direct and purposeful, calling upon the gods to mend the throne's broken essence, to restore its strength so that the king who sat upon it could once again rule with divine authority. The entire performance was a form of supernatural medicine where the patient was an object and the cure was a matter of national security. Can you picture the scene? The most powerful people in the empire gathered not to plan a war or sign a treaty, but to anxiously watch priests perform a delicate operation on a chair. It reveals a worldview where misfortune had a tangible source, a crack in the cosmic foundation that could be located and repaired. The kingdom's fate did not rest on armies alone, but on the ritual purity of a single sacred object. A crown prince was murdered within the very walls of the palace. The archives whisper his name, Tudhaliya the Younger, a figure almost completely erased from the official history of the Hittite Empire. He was the designated heir, the son of a king, and yet his story survives only in fragments, in scattered texts, and most chillingly in the curses meant to punish his killers. Piecing together this political crime feels like assembling a broken vase where the sharpest shards are the spells intended to avenge him. One text, a loyalty oath imposed on the royal court after the fact, forces officials to swear they will not kill a king's son, a clear and direct reference to the assassination. The punishment for breaking this oath was a litany of divine horrors, calling upon the gods to turn the conspirator's land to swamp and his family to dust. This was not a simple murder, it was a crime that shook the foundations of the state, forcing the throne to legally forbid the court from killing its own future rulers. Why would the royal family, the very institution that depended on clear succession, purge its own crown prince from the records? The answer seems to lie in the brutal politics of a divided court. Evidence suggests Tudhaliya the Younger was the son of King Tudhaliya III, a monarch from a secondary branch of the royal family. His ascension would have represented a shift in power, a victory for one faction that threatened the influence and privilege of another. The assassination was likely a coup, a preemptive strike by nobles or even royal relatives who could not accept this young man as their future king. The murder was successful, but the cover-up was even more so. The official annals, the chronicles meant to record the glorious deeds of the kings, simply skip over him. It is as if he never existed. This was more than just hiding a crime. It was a spiritual annihilation, an attempt to remove his very soul from the memory of the kingdom and the eyes of the gods. The turmoil this single act caused must have been catastrophic. A civil Cold War fought in shadowy corridors and through whispered oaths, where trust was a luxury and every noble was a potential assassin. The story of Tudhaliya the Younger is a ghost in the machine of empire, a stark reminder that the greatest threats to a king often came not from foreign armies, but from the hands of those who served him at his own table. A king could not simply ask the gods for guidance. He had to go and meet them in their own realm. The Hittite archives reveal a practice of startling intimacy, a ritual known as dream incubation, where a person would sleep in a sacred place to receive a direct message from the divine. This was not passive hoping for a vision, it was an active, carefully orchestrated quest. The supplicant, often the king himself or a high priest, would undergo a period of purification, fasting and cleansing themselves to become a suitable vessel for a god's voice. Then they would lie down to sleep within the hallowed confines of a temple, a place believed to be thin, a boundary where the world of the gods and the world of men blurred together. The night was not a time of rest, but of anxious anticipation, awaiting for a breakthrough from another dimension. The dreams that came were not considered simple fantasies. They were official dispatches, and like any state document, they required expert analysis. Upon waking, the dreamer would immediately recount every detail, every symbol and sequence to a specialized priest known as a seer. This interpreter was a master of a complex symbolic language, a celestial code. A dream of a lion might not signify danger, but the roaring voice of a specific god. A vision of a crumbling wall could foretell the fall of a rival kingdom, not a literal disaster at home. The interpretation was everything, turning a jumble of nighttime images into a strategic directive, a medical diagnosis, or a solemn warning. Can you feel the weight of that morning, the pressure on the priest to get the translation exactly right, knowing that the king's next decision, perhaps the fate of the entire empire, hinged on his understanding of a metaphor sent from heaven? This was a system that acknowledged the profound power of the subconscious mind, long before the concept had a name. It was a sophisticated blend of spiritual faith and what we might now call psychology, a formal channel for the deepest parts of the human psyche to speak and be heard, all under the guise of a conversation with the gods. Even their system of justice was a bridge between the courtroom and the cosmos. The Hittite law code, preserved across numerous tablets, presents a world where a simple dispute could end not with a fine but with a curse. This was not a rigid list of commandments, but a collection of legal precedents, a record of how cases should be resolved, and it reveals a society grappling with how to price everything from stolen livestock to a severed nose. But woven into these practical judgments are clauses so bizarre they defy modern legal logic. Consider the laws concerning assault. The punishment for biting someone was not uniform, it was meticulously calibrated to the outcome. If you bit a commoner and caused an injury, you paid a fine. But if that same bite somehow led to the victim's death, the penalty escalated dramatically. The law was not just concerned with the act, but with its ultimate, often unintended consequence. This reflects a system focused less on intent and more on restoring a balance that had been broken, a scales of justice approach where the weight of the punishment was measured by the depth of the harm. Yet the code ventures into even stranger territory with offenses that demanded supernatural sentences. For certain crimes, particularly those involving deceit or broken oaths, the prescribed punishment was not a payment or physical mutilation, but a divine curse. The law would essentially hand the culprit over to the gods for judgment, calling upon a specific deity to inflict a terrible fate. A person who lied under oath might be condemned to have their lineage wiped out, their family line extinguished by heavenly decree. This was the law outsourcing its ultimate authority to a higher power, acknowledging that some transgressions were so profound that only a god could truly settle the account. This blending of the mundane and the magical shows that the Hittites did not see a clear separation between civic order and cosmic order. A broken contract was not just a business dispute, it was an offense against the God of Oath. The law code was therefore more than a legal document. It was a ritual text, a guide for maintaining harmony in both the human and the divine realms. It was a system that understood some wounds required silver to heal, while others demanded the intervention of the storm god himself. Centuries before the great kings of Hattusa built their empire, a ruler named Anata etched his legacy into a tablet of metal, leaving behind a text that is both a triumphant war cry and a spectral warning. This is the Anata text, one of the oldest Hittite records we possess, a proclamation so fierce it would define the very soul of Hittite kingship for generations. King Anata boasts of his military campaigns with raw, unvarnished pride. He recounts how he conquered city after city, and when he reached the settlement of Hattusa, he did not just defeat it. He sowed its fields with weeds and declared it accursed forever. But his victory proclamation does not end with a simple record of destruction. It culminates in a terrifying curse aimed at any person foolish enough to defy his decree. He solemnly warns that if any king in the future dares to rebuild Hattusa, then the storm god of heaven will personally strike that man down. Think about the sheer audacity of this statement. A mortal king, speaking with the authority of a god, is not merely commanding his own subjects, he is trying to command the flow of history itself. He is attempting to reach out from the past and choke the future to keep a city he hated dead and buried for all time. The profound strangeness of this text lies in its foundational role. This boastful, vengeful king, laying a divine curse upon the land, became a model for what Hittite power should look like. The kings who came after him, the ones who would ironically make the cursed city of Hattusa their glorious capital, absorbed this lesson. They learned that true kingship was not just about building, but about the God-given right to unmake. It established an ideology where the monarch was the partner of the gods, his words carrying the weight of cosmic law, his curses as binding as any treaty. Anata sought to erase a city from the map and from memory, but in doing so, he permanently inscribed a new, terrifying idea of royal power onto the consciousness of an empire. Death was not an end for a Hittite king, but a final, state-sponsored journey. The royal funerary ritual, known as the Salis Wastais, was an elaborate, multi-day spectacle designed to guide the monarch's spirit safely to the underworld, a process so vital it required the entire kingdom to participate. The moment the king breathed his last, the rites began with a haunting and persistent call. For days on end, priests and family members would repeatedly shout the king's name, a vocal anchor to keep his soul from drifting lost between worlds. This was followed by waves of ritual laments where professional mourners wailed specific, prescribed songs of grief, their cries structuring the sorrow into a form the gods would understand. But the ceremony's scale was staggering. The king could not travel to the afterlife alone. To serve him in the next world as they had in this one, a gruesome payment was made. His personal attendants, from cupbearers and cooks to stable hands and guards, were sacrificed. Dozens, perhaps even hundreds of animals were also slaughtered, their lives offered as provisions for the long journey ahead. The climax of this days-long ceremony was a final, macabre feast. The deceased king was propped up at the head of a table, and his successor, along with the entire court, would sit down to share a ceremonial banquet with the corpse. This was not an act of morbidity, but one of profound transition. They were sharing one last meal as a community, symbolically passing authority from the dead to the living while reaffirming their bond. The entire ritual was a cosmic relocation project, moving the most important soul in the kingdom from his earthly palace to his new divine abode. Every chant, every sacrifice, every toast was a step on that road, ensuring the king arrived with his household intact and his royal status recognized by the gods of the netherworld. It was the ultimate expression of a belief that the king's duty to his people did not end with his death, and their duty to him was only fulfilled when they had secured his place among the stars. A single letter from the Hittite archives, known today as the Milawata letter, throws a direct and puzzling light on the empire's troubled western frontier. This message from a Hittite king addresses a subordinate ruler in the vital coastal city of Milawata, a place we know as Miletus. The king is furious, accusing this man of breaking a solemn treaty by attacking a Hittite vassal state. But the true mystery lies not in the accusation itself, but in the shadowy power lurking behind the conflict. The letter explicitly states that the ruler of Milawata had acted with the support of a man named Atpas, who was a known agent of the king of Ahiyawa. Here, in this dry diplomatic complaint, is the clearest evidence we have of Ahiyawan meddling deep within the Hittite sphere of influence. Milawata was not some distant outpost, it was a key Aegean port, and a proxy war was being fought on its doorstep between two great powers. The debate over who the Ahiyawans truly were is one of the most enduring puzzles in ancient history. For decades, most scholars have become convinced that Ahiyawa is the Hittite name for a major Mycenaean Greek power, perhaps even the kingdom of Mycenae itself or a confederation led by it. The names in the Hittite text seem to echo the Greek of Homer's epics. Is the Ahiyawan king Agamemnon wearing a Hittite diplomatic mask? This interpretation transforms the Milawata letter from a minor border dispute into a fragment of a much larger story. A cold war between the land-based Hittite Empire and the seafaring Greeks. Yet not everyone is convinced. A minority of scholars argue that Ahiyawa could have been a smaller Anatolian kingdom, a powerful neighbor rather than a distant civilization from across the sea. They point to the logistical difficulty of projecting power so far from the Greek mainland and the lack of overwhelming archaeological evidence for a massive Greek presence. But the Milawata letter makes this counter-argument harder to sustain. It describes a level of political interference that suggests a deep, sustained interest in Anatolian affairs, the kind of interest a regional superpower would have. This is not the stuff of Homeric legend with heroes dueling before the walls of Troy. This is the gritty reality of geopolitics, of treaties broken and borders shifting, all recorded by the very people who lived it. The Hittites were not writing myth, they were filing reports, and in those reports we find the faint, bureaucratic outline of a world we thought we knew only from poetry. A home could become a prison, not by its walls, but by the presence of an unwanted guest from beyond the grave. The Hittite archives contain a meticulous guide for exorcising a haunted house, a step-by-step ritual to purge a dwelling of a malevolent ghost or a demonic intruder. This was not a matter of simple fear, but of restoring a broken sanctuary, a place where a family could no longer live in peace. The procedure was as precise as a military operation, blending physical action with potent incantation. It began with the creation of a symbolic boundary. The exorcist would take a bronze peg, an object believed to possess the power to pin down and restrain spiritual forces, and he would drive it directly into the floor of the house right at the threshold. This single act was a declaration of war, a stake driven into the very ground to keep the entity from fleeing or spreading its influence. Next came the offerings, but these were not gifts of appeasement. Specific foods were laid out, things like thick porridge and coarse bread, a meal fit for the dead. The incantation spoken over this spread was a direct command, not a polite request. It told the ghost, "This is your portion, now take it and go." The ritual was a transaction, a final payment to settle the spirit's account and send it on its way. The climax of the ceremony involved a powerful verbal expulsion. the exorcist would recite a long, binding spell, listing all the places the ghost could no longer be, and commanding it to return to the dark earth, to the underworld that was its proper home. Every word was a weapon, every action a carefully calculated move in a battle for the soul of a home. Imagine the family watching, hoping that the driving of a bronze peg and the chanting of ancient words would be enough to reclaim their space from an invisible terror. This was a world where a creak in the night was not just the house settling, but a potential sign of a spiritual infestation that required the state's most advanced supernatural technology to fix. Even the king's personal guards were bound by rules that read like a manual for absolute paranoia. Among the sprawling royal archives, one text stands out for its obsessive detail: the instructions for the royal bodyguard. This was not a simple list of duties, but a deep dive into the psychology of loyalty and the constant fear of betrayal that haunted the throne. The guards were forbidden from the most basic human interactions while on duty. They were not to gossip or share stories, for a careless word could reveal a weakness in the palace's defenses. They were strictly prohibited from drinking alcohol, ensuring their senses remained sharp and their judgment unclouded. Most strikingly, they were ordered not to speak to certain people at all, a list that likely included foreign envoys, disgraced nobles, or even members of the extended royal family who might be plotting against the king. The instructions leave almost nothing to chance, dictating where a guard should stand, how he should hold his weapon, and precisely when he should rotate his post to prevent anyone from learning his routine. The sheer level of detail implies a world where the monarch trusted no one completely, not even the men sworn to take a spear for him. A guard who got too friendly with a courtier could be co-opted. A guard who drank too much could be bribed, and a guard who talked too much could inadvertently reveal the king's schedule to an assassin. This was a system designed to create the perfect human shield, a man stripped of his personal connections and vulnerabilities, who existed only to protect the living embodiment of the state. What does it say about life at the pinnacle of Hittite power, when your closest protectors had to be legally prevented from holding a normal conversation? It reveals a court simmering with silent suspicion, where the greatest threat to the king was not a foreign army, but the whispered conspiracy just outside his own chamber door. The sun did not simply vanish at the end of the day, according to the Hittites. It descended into the terrifying silence of the underworld. Their solar deity was not a distant god of the sky, but a goddess who made this impossible journey every single night, passing through the land of the dead to be reborn at dawn. This was the solar deity of the underworld, a figure of immense power who held the keys to the cycle of death and rebirth itself. Her voyage was the most dangerous moment in the daily life of the cosmos, a time when the light could be extinguished forever if the proper balance was not maintained. And the Hittites believed the king had a direct personal role in ensuring her safe passage. This belief gave rise to one of their most intimate and bizarre royal rituals, known as the taking of the hands. In this ceremony, performed at a critical juncture of the year, the entire cosmic order was condensed into a single human gesture. The king would be led by the hand, like a child or a supplicant, by a high priestess representing the goddess. They would walk together in a solemn procession, reenacting the goddess's own journey through the darkness. The king, the most powerful man in the empire, was symbolically placed in the role of the vulnerable son, dependent on the guidance of the divine to navigate the perils of the underworld and emerge triumphant. Can you picture the scene, the hushed temple, the flickering torchlight, the two most important figures in the kingdom walking hand in hand in a sacred pantomime? This was not just a pageant, it was a profound act of sympathetic magic. By physically performing the myth, the king and the priestess were channeling its power, ensuring that the real sun would complete its journey and rise again. The ritual tied the fate of the monarchy directly to the fate of the universe. If the king played his part correctly, the sun would rise, the crops would grow, and the kingdom would prosper. If he failed, the entire cosmic mechanism could grind to a halt. This ceremony reveals a world where the boundary between myth and reality was paper-thin, where a king's most important duty was to literally walk the path of a goddess every year, holding her hand in the dark to keep the world from ending. These 25 discoveries are far more than a simple list. They are a collection of whispers from a world we are only just beginning to hear. From the high-stakes political scandal of a murdered prince to the chilling magic of a substitute king, from the advanced athletic science of a horse training manual to the raw vulnerability of a king's plague prayers, these clay fragments reveal a civilization of staggering complexity. The Hittites were not just warriors and bureaucrats. They were deeply spiritual people who saw the entire cosmos as a living, breathing entity that required constant negotiation. They believed a throne could fall sick and needed healing, that a king must walk hand in hand with a sun goddess to ensure the dawn, and that a simple scorpion sting was a battle involving both herbs and gods. This was a world where diplomacy, science, and magic were not separate disciplines, but intertwined threads in the same fabric of reality. Each of these 25 strange finds adds another brushstroke to a portrait that challenges the old, simplistic image of the ancient past. They force us to see the Hittites not as a lost empire in a history book, but as a vibrant, sophisticated, and profoundly human society, one that grappled with questions of power, faith, and fate that still resonate with us today. The Royal Archives of Hattusa do not just give us answers, they give us better, more fascinating questions. And we are left to wonder which of these echoes from the Bronze Age speaks to you the most. Was it the ghost of the usurper Kurunta, the desperate logic of the plague prayers, or the eerie precursor to vampire myths? Let us know which of these 25 strange discoveries captured your imagination down in the comments.